What's up, Tyndale, and welcome to our episode 4 of CAE Pods. Can you believe that this is our last episode of our mini-series on language skills?
I can.
It just seems like yesterday we were talking about note-taking and listening and academic presentations and reading, but now we're covering our fourth skill, writing, specifically academic writing. Now for this topic, there's not really much of a difference between the academic skill and the language skill. Writing is writing. But we're hoping by the time that we're done today that you'll learn some tips about how to write strong academic papers. Not only that, but we're hoping that you'll learn to incorporate your own voice and cultural understandings while still meeting the North American academic standards. But before we get to that, I'm Kerrie.
I'm Brent, and let's be honest, since I oversee writing and tutoring services, this is probably the academic skill I'm most excited to talk about, and we will get there, but I'm also super excited because we have a member of our B.Ed faculty joining us later in this podcast. Who? You'll have to stay tuned to find out.
Ooh, very exciting. Yes, we can't wait to hear from one of our professors to share on this topic later. But first, Brent, why don't you start us off with some of your thoughts? What are some helpful tips for students in terms of academic writing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's tricky about this topic in particular is that there's so many things we could talk about, right? There's so many aspects of writing. There's all the different grammar things. And I could have, sat down and said, let's talk about prepositions, or let's talk about being overly repetitive. But I don't know that that's super helpful because every single language has different things that when they try to translate to English maybe doesn't work perfectly. And I don't know how I would pinpoint exactly what to talk about. So instead, I'm going to try to pick something that applies, I think, across the board. And that's this idea of academic tone. I think a lot of students, when they're writing papers, and this is even true of some native speakers as well, is they think they have to use this like overly complex, super sophisticated wording. They use these big terms and this vocabulary that's just over the top. And while I understand kind of where that comes from, when you read a journal article, they often use these complex terms. I think sometimes the danger is that when we try to sound fancy, when we try to use this big language and we don't necessarily know what it all means, it can make us sound at best pretentious and at worst like we don't know what we're talking about. So I would say as at least the starting point, yes, we want to keep an academic tone, but let's not go overboard with the fancy words.
Absolutely. And I'm going to use a fancy word, jargon. So that's literally what jargon is, using big fancy words specific to a discipline. But you don't want to assume that your audience knows what you're talking about. So don't be afraid to define it, even if you think it's simple or that everyone should know, because sometimes they don't, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think there's a line there, right? Because you don't want to go overboard with defining every single term. Because, right. If you're in a discipline, if you're in a theology class, you don't need to necessarily define what theology is. I think most people would understand that. But maybe if you're reading like homoousios, as we've brought up in past podcasts, you might have to clarify that because even people in the field might need to have a little more of an idea of what do you mean by that term. So yes, define your jargon, make sure that when you are using these complicated terms, we know what you mean by that. I would also just say that clarity is more important than complexity. Yeah. Yes, we want complex ideas. That's absolutely true. We are in university. But I don't think we have to use complex language all the time to communicate them. Simple language that is going to be clear, concise, to the point is actually going to be more effective and help your professor and your readers understand what you were saying than if you try to use these overly complicated words. But a couple of other things, since we want to maybe avoid the big vocabulary, vary your sentence length. If you are only using short sentences, of 6 or 7 words, it's going to feel like you're in rush hour traffic. You're going to be here stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, every time you begin a sentence. But if all you use is long sentences, it's very easy to feel like you're running out of breath because you just kind of keep reading, and then you go again, right? So I think it's okay to have some variety in your sentences. And I would also just say learn the sentence structure, the essay structure that's common in North American studies. So every essay should have an introduction, body, and conclusion. And every essay needs a thesis statement in your introduction, where you are defining what is the main point of this essay. If you don't have those things, yes, your ideas might still be good, and maybe even there is an element of clarity in your communication, but if your professor doesn't see that structure, they're going to be confused. And it's probably going to hurt your grade. So I recommend try to learn that structure and fit the simple communication we're talking about into that structure. I would say, though, more important than trying to be fancy is this idea of practicing, right? So when you are trying to get better at something, the more you do it, the better you become. So when you learn an instrument, when you are trying to learn a sport, if you just show up on the soccer field one day, or football, all of a sudden people are going to, you don't know what you're doing if you haven't actually put in that practice. Nobody learns how to play Fur Elise on the piano until they've learned their scales. You need to do that practice and do that work. And the same goes with writing. If you just try and dive in writing an essay on day one, it's going to be tough, but if you can get practice in other kinds of writing, it's going to help you out a lot.
Yeah, and we would also say, like, to practice writing in English. Like, of course, it's going to be so much easier to write in your own native language and then probably translate it afterwards. But we would push you to go the extra mile and write in English, whether it's like a couple of sentences a day and then slowly you write a paragraph and then that becomes like an essay, and try to make it about something fun. Maybe you want to journal, or maybe you want to write a short story or a poem, something, so that you're interested in it. But practicing writing in English first without directly translating it will be a beneficial skill. We promise you that.
Yeah, no, because I think, like, translation's not one-to-one. When you take a word in another language and you try to put it in English, or vice versa for that matter, if we try to take English and put it into another language, it doesn't always translate perfectly. There's times where we don't necessarily have a word for it in English for something that's maybe in your language. So there's that, and the goal is to find your voice, your style of communication. And I know we're going to talk about that in a little later. The other thing I would just say, though, is when you're writing, don't insist on having this perfect first draft when you start. I mean, there are sometimes people will like sit there and they'll get like scared by the blinking cursor on Microsoft Word because it's just like almost taunting them with the fact that they haven't written anything, and sure, there's I know sometimes that there's that stress of like, what should I be saying and how do I say it, but it's okay to kind of just go for it and write some things down and polish it up later. It's called a first draft for a reason, because it's the first one. It's not necessarily your final draft. It's not what you're submitting for your professor. So take that time to go back, to edit, to make sure that you're happy with the content that you have. And if that means that as you're writing, you have to put in a filler word, you have to throw in, I don't know, like a word from your original language because you can't think of exactly what it is in English, that's okay. Come back and fill it in later when you have some more time.
Exactly. I mean, I feel so relieved after hearing you say that, because I think that was one of my biggest struggles when I was in school. I felt that my first draft had to be perfect, and a lot of the times I wouldn't write anything on the page because I was trying to edit it in my head. But I think the more I did school, I realized it's actually better to get something tangible and physical on the page so that you can go back and edit it. Like what Brent was saying, you can look back at those filler words and then be like, okay, actually, you know what, this is the concept I was trying to think of, or actually I don't like my second point anymore, I have a new argument. But having multiple drafts is really good because you can see the process of your writing getting better. And I think that's what writing is, right? It's a craft. It's a process. It's not something that it's like, okay, it's got to be perfect right away, that's it. Like, as they say, right? It's not so much about the destination, it's about the journey, how you get there.
Well, speaking of journeys, one thing I would recommend you be a little cautious of in the writing, at least at this stage, is the use of AI. At this point, at least as of recording this podcast, the policy at Tyndale is that you can't use AI unless you have your professor's permission. Right. And that includes translation software. So if you're sitting here being like, I'm going to write it in my own language and then translate it with ChatGPT or whatever, that's going to be problematic at this point unless you have your professor's permission. But I also think, like we've been saying, that practice of sitting down and writing it in English, it's going to be tough at first, but the more you do it, the easier it's going to get, and the more you're going to be able to almost start like thinking in English as you prepare your papers. So that's one thing. And the last tip I'd say, and this might sound weird, is that one of the best ways to learn how to write better is to read good writing. There's a lot of journal articles out there, and sure, not all of them are going to be considered great writing, but I think the more you read academic work, the more you read how professors and other people in the field are writing in these disciplines, the more you're going to identify this is what good writing in this field looks like, and then you're going to be able to kind of imitate those things. I'm not saying use the same complex language that they maybe use, but you might learn more about the structure, how they organize things in their papers, and then you can follow suit for yourself.
So speaking of reading good writing, I am going to read an ad. That's what we do since we're a podcast.
True.
Today we're hyping up the Guardian's Nest. It's a solid hangout spot on campus known for more than just mixing metaphors. Guardian Nest. I mean, why does a guardian need a nest? It's okay. Conveniently, it's tucked away in the back corner of the dining hall. The Guardian's Nest is your go-to spot to unwind, laugh, and maybe get over that competitive game of foosball that you just lost. It's got video games, ping pong, board games, comfy seats, and it contains one of the most chaotic art situations you've ever seen. I think there's like a pig with glasses.
Yeah, it's very colorful.
Very cute. Whether you're meeting friends or taking a break between classes or maybe hiding from your responsibilities, we don't recommend you do that. That's okay. The Nest has got you covered. Get covered with wings. Got it. I got it now. The Guardian's Nest is easily one of the most fun rooms on campus and a space where chaos counts as community. Crazy. Wow. So this is like my favorite part of the podcast where we get to introduce our lovely guest. This is Charmain Brown. Hi, Charmain.
Hi, Kerrie. Hi, Brent. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Charmain Brown is an assistant professor in the Bachelor of Education program at Tyndale University. She is passionate and she's an experienced educator whose work is grounded in curriculum, instruction, equity, and inclusion. She's the author of several resources for educators, including Possibilities Addressing Poverty in Elementary Schools and the e-text Black Canadian Woman, A Legacy of Strength and 365 Black Canadian Curriculum. With years of experience as a teacher, curriculum consultant, and university instructor, Charmain brings a grounded and thoughtful perspective to writing efficiently. And beyond her professional work, Charmain enjoys staying active at the gym and has been known to watch the same movie over 50 times.
50?
Yes.
You want to share what movie?
Yeah.
There are several. It's a problem. I realize that, and I'm working through it. But every time I watch these movies, I see something or hear something that I feel like I haven't seen or heard before.
Yeah.
So definitely Rocky is up there.
Okay.
Is in my top 5. Back to the Future is definitely
love
past
that.
50. Lion King, the original animation, definitely is up there. And Boys in the Hood.
Okay, fair
so
enough.
It's just a variety of a lot
Love
of different
it.
things. Yeah.
Absolutely love it. Well, and it's funny because I think one of the things we know that you're big on is literacy, and I think there's media literacy and things, and I can see you're like getting things from different things. But as we turn kind of to the writing topic that we're looking at today, we know that universities have expectations. For good and bad, that is just the reality of things. And specifically here at North American universities, we talked a little bit about, the structure of essays and how that's sort of something you just kind of have to adapt to. But we know that in other cultures, that structure and those standards might look a little different. So from your perspective, how does our cultural backgrounds shape the way that we approach writing and communication?
I'm so glad that you're talking about this because we don't really talk about that cultural piece.
Yeah. Right.
That's such an important part. Like, writing is a cultural practice. When we write, how we write, the conventions that we use are grounded within the culture that we are from, how we've been raised, the country that we live in, the city that we live in, the background that we have. So all of that comes into play. And so we have to recognize that writing conventions are not universal. So what is part of your practice may not be viewed in the same way, not that it's not acknowledged, but it may be viewed differently within a different context, within a different culture. So I think of it like in some cultures, writing is looked upon as a dialogue between people who have equal footing. And so you might kind of write in a way where it's trying to be respectful and humbling to the reader. So you don't really kind of get to the point, you kind of circle around the point. Whereas in North American context, we are more direct.
Yeah.
We're like, what do you have to say? Why are you saying it? Like, clarity is important. So if you come from a culture where you're a little bit more softer in getting to a point, you don't want to kind of be adamant about a particular positionality within your writing. In North American culture, that's really the other way around. We want to know what you're thinking, why are you thinking it, and what's your support for it, and kind of get right to it. So those are kind of some things to think about. Like that's just one example of a cultural difference. And so when you are coming from a different place, from a different country, a different culture, or even if you were raised here and you've been raised in a different culture. So for myself, though I was raised here and did all my schooling here, I do write with a kind of a Caribbean sensibility because of the way that I was raised, the way that we speak, the way that we do storytelling. That comes through in my writing. Now, the great thing about it is we want who you are to come through in your writing. Exactly. That is valued within North American context of academic writing. We want to hear your voice and hear it from who you are. So we're not negating who you are or negating the culture that you're bringing to your writing and to your research or whatever that you might be doing or writing about. We want to hear your voice and we want to hear it from that perspective. But then keeping in mind that, kind of get to the point, depending. Yeah.
Exactly. I love that you shared how your background influences your writing and how do you balance that with like the North American academic standards for writing. One quick story I want to share is my pastor got the chance to do a missions trip in Indonesia. And so my pastor, he was born, raised here. And so in terms of sermon writing, usually just like other types of writing, like essay writing, you have your 3 points. You got to find a way to get people to the altar and that's about it, right? So we're like, okay, we have that anchor text we're going to use, and then we have our 3 points to prove that anchor text, and then there's some sort of call to action at the end. And that works really well in North America, and that's what I think we're used to when we go to church. But when he started preaching in Indonesia, it just, like, he felt like the people were not connecting with his message, and it was kind of interesting. And he spoke to his mentor, and he was like, what am I doing wrong? Like, what's happening? And what he learned, not just with Indonesia, but with a lot of Eastern countries in terms of the style of writing, with sermon writing, we would think in North America, we have our points 1, 2, 3. But in the Eastern context, their points are usually, you start with 3, you go to 1, you go to 2, but then you come back to 3, and somehow it all makes sense. And that was an interesting style of writing that he had to learn. And when he did learn that and, worked on his craft of sermon writing, it got better and he was able to really connect with the people there. And I always think about that because I think it really does matter of if we're going to do something like preach in a different cultural context, like how do we balance that? But like what Charmain was saying, how do we also still be authentic to our own voice?
Yeah, I love maybe not, love is not the right word. I think there's a tension here of like, you want to be able to communicate in your own style and your own way of saying things, but the standards don't necessarily fit that. And I think a big example of that is critical thinking. That's something you were talking about structure, and we both kind of mentioned it earlier. But critical thinking is tricky because that comes up all the time in university. We're constantly trying to figure out think critically about this thing, and I think professors often assume we're all on the same page, but students don't necessarily understand what that means. So when you, what advice do you have for a student when they're doing an assignment where they're asked to think critically or to critically engage with something? Can you give some advice on how to do that effectively.
So you hear critical thinking all the time. It's in the syllabus. It's your professors constantly saying, don't forget, you need to be implementing critical thinking. Are you thinking critically? It's constantly, but sometimes we don't really fully understand what that means.
It's like that jargon that we were talking about.
Exactly. It's back to jargon and sometimes even back to culture, because what critical thinking might mean in a different cultural context might be viewed differently here. Right. So some cultures or some people think of being critical as being judgmental, right? Because we hear that in our talk, like when we're just interacting with people and we say, oh, you're being so critical. It's like you're being negative. Right. You're being judgmental. And in actuality, critical thinking is about evaluating, analyzing, about questioning. It's about bringing variety of perspectives within your writing. So if you are, writing a thesis, or you're writing something that requires an argument, or you need to support an argument or support a point, what are the other viewpoints? What are the other perspectives? What are the pros and cons? Like, it's kind of questioning, not just questioning what you're reading and what you're writing about, and kind of giving those different perspectives. They may be yours, they may be others. And so that you can see like so whether you're confirming or contradicting the point that you're bringing across. So it's not about, here's the point. It's not always just about summarizing. This is the topic. Let me summarize back to the 3 points, right? Summarize the 3 points. And then we move on. It's kind of like, okay, if those are the points, what are some of the other viewpoints? What are some questions that you have based on what that writer or that other author or that has said? It's kind of doing that deep questioning and analyzing of the writing that you're doing and the researching that you're doing. That's what the critical thinking comes in. So it's really important because it's showing not that you just understand the content, but you're thinking of it in a very deep way. And that's what us as professors think about when we think about critical thinking. Is it that deeper level of thinking and understanding of the content that has been presented and that you're sharing in your writing?
Yeah, love that difference between summary and like this deeper analysis. I think I read a lot of student papers when people are just starting in university and they think the point of writing an essay is to just summarize the literature. And sure, there's an element of that's part of this, but so much of what professors want is your insights, your take on things, and how do you build these things into arguments that are going to communicate your point. And I love that you said it's not just about negativity. Right. Like, it's not just judgy or rude or whatever. There's actually room for positive criticism as well.
Absolutely.
Right? You can see where authors have done a really good job of communicating their point, where they are strong in their argumentation, where they have used good evidence or things like that. So, well, given that then, we've kind of been like talking around things a little bit, but let's get a little bit more practical here. If we've got a student who's coming from another culture, or even, as you said, has maybe grown up in Canada, but is maybe not as familiar with like academic contexts and some of that, like the cultural differences that come with that. How can students navigate that effectively? What can they be focusing on to produce strong writing in this context without maybe losing their own voice in the process?
That's a really good question. I guess we have to think about the difference between language and rhetoric, right? So language is like focusing on the grammar and sentence structure. And I know you mentioned this before, Brent, about like, focusing on sentence structure and have I got the spelling right? Yeah. Whereas with rhetoric, we really want to focus on the organization and the content. Like, what have you included there and what is it saying and are you communicating effectively? So it's kind of thinking about, it's a balance. Of course we want to have good grammar. Of course we want to have good sentence structure. But that is less important than the content, than what you're writing about and how you are writing it. Right. So the organizational piece of your academic paper needs to be considered. So do you have those points? Are they coming across clear? Is your thinking clear within it? The other piece to think about is back to what you said about your own personal voice and how does that come through? And do you have a balance between looking at different perspectives, how it's been organized, but then also including your own thinking within it? So it doesn't just seem like you're summarizing or regurgitating things that other people have said and you are just the narrator of that.
Yeah, I think a great simple example of that is when you quote somebody,
Mm-hmm.
don't just drop the quote and move on. Like, analyze it. Explain, why is this quote here? How is it relevant? And that's the place where your voice is able to come in and be like, this is how I understand the argument. This is how I understand what's going on, and sharing your own perspective on things.
Exactly. So it's really, that piece is really important to have the balance between them, because professors are really, like, as a professor, I'm interested in your thinking.
Yeah.
I want to know not just what you know, but what you think about what you know. And what are you bringing to the conversation as well, based on your experience and your background and your skill and your expertise, because you do have that. And that's part of the learning process as well.
Exactly. And I think what both of you have set up, I'm sitting with two professors here, grammar and syntax and sentence structure, that's all very important. And those are things that can be taught, but finding your own voice and honing in on your craft, that takes time and that takes effort. And if you're not intentional about it, it's very easy to lose that. But I think the opposite is also true, because if you do take the time to work on that, then you learn, okay, well, this is my perspective. This is how I think about this. Actually, I don't know what I think about this. Maybe I need to read up more about it. And through the process of doing that, you get to find your authentic self. And that comes through in your writing.
For sure.
And it makes writing more fun.
Yeah.
That, like, you enjoy your own paper.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, because if you're just sitting there writing what you think you have to do,
Yes.
that's tedious. That's boring. Nobody wants to do that. But when you actually get to explore and navigate your own experience in light of whatever topic you're writing about, that's where it becomes alive. Yeah.
I remember that experience happening to me when I was in university. I was doing my master's, and we had to do a paper on a book that we had read, and I was not in agreement with what some of the concepts that were within the book at all. It just did not mesh with who I was. It did not mesh with my background. It did not mesh with my thinking. And it was the first time I kind of wrote a paper from the heart. Like, I met all the expectations of what was expected, but the style of writing, it was kind of my voice was at the center of it. And I remember the prof making a point of talking about it in class when she was returning it, kind of saying, like, this was the most like incredible, not that was like great writing, but I'm not boasting myself.
Sure, yeah.
But this was like the most authentic writing, basically, is what she was saying. Like, this was so good because she wanted to hear our voice, and this is like a tenured professor, been doing this forever, right? So you really want to, you feel like you want to please. I get that, because I experienced that too. But that was the first time I realized my voice matters and my writing style matters, even though I wasn't a great writer. What I have to say about what we're reading and what we're doing is important. Yeah.
See, I like that, because when you are authentic with your writing, like, it comes across in your writing. And so, like, what I'm hearing you're saying is that your professor wanted to engage in your piece of writing, and it becomes more than just words on a paper. It becomes a conversation.
Exactly.
And it invites other people in. But if you feel like, okay, these are the parameters I have to write with, you almost feel a bit stifled. And again, that's another thing that people can sense. I know we've been talking about the theory, love theory, but what are some practical tips? Like, what would you say are some simple things a student can do to just grow in this area?
Well, you both gave some really great tips before, but and the first one you've mentioned, read model papers. Like if you're talking about a particular topic, find other articles on that same topic or similar. Or if there is something your prof has shared with you and you enjoyed reading it, now read it with that analytical eye of how did they write it? Where's the argument? How are they doing this? Where's critical thinking happening here? Where is rhetoric within here? Like, think of it from that writer's analytical eye to see, okay, how are they organizing their thinking? So that's a really great one, is reading model papers or exemplars. Use templates, and you mentioned this as well. So you want to organize your thinking, use templates and there's tons online. I'm sure the Writing Center can support with that as well. But just simple templates just to kind of get your thinking out there. Back to the idea of drafts. You were talking about drafts. Just get your thinking out there. Don't just start writing paragraph style. Get some points out there, get your thinking rolling, and then turn those points into sentences. Those sentences become paragraphs, and before you know it, you got a paper. So templates are really, really supportive. Another one I think is really important. I don't think students do this enough. I value this as a prof. Seek feedback from your prof in the process of writing.
Yeah.
So not after you're done and say, can you read this over like 2 days before it's due or the day before it's due? Can you read this over and give me some feedback? Like, no, because it's done.
That's what I'm going to do when I mark it.
That's right. Yeah. We're at that point. But in the process. So maybe you've got the first point done. You've got the argumentative sentence done. You've got the thesis written. Send it to your prof. What's your thinking about this? Do you have any feedback? And they're going to give you descriptive feedback. I love giving feedback in the process. And that's more beneficial than waiting till the end and then I'm going to give all this stuff and then you're feeling like you have to rewrite the whole thing. It's better to kind of get it in the process. So you'll, okay, this is what they're looking for. They're saying this stuff is really great. This stuff I need to improve on. I need to dig deeper here. Then you're going to apply that moving forward, right? So that one is a huge one. And then the Writing Center. Use the resources, the amazing resources that are available here on campus at Tyndale. These people love their work. They love giving support. So use them.
Well, and it's funny because that thing about getting feedback from your prof midstream, we can do that here too, right?
Yes.
Like you don't have to come. I mean, yes, we love looking at drafts that are in process, but yeah, in process is key. It doesn't have to be your like right before you're about to submit it. We're gonna look at it for an hour and then send it in. Like spend that time. Let us sit down with you and work through your ideas. We're happy to do that just as much as your profs.
Yeah, and when you do that. You're probably talking through what your paper is going to be about more than you're looking at the writing at that point. And so that's where the real thinking is coming through in the conversation. And so when you have that conversation, you're actually writing at the same time, but it's just in your head at that point. And so the more that you talk about it, that's another big one, is talk what you want to write about. Because if you can say it, you'll be able to write it. And many times we don't do that. We go jump right into the writing. What's the best sentence structure? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Say it out loud. Record yourself talking through the arguments. Then bring that to the Writing Center and have them like, this is my thinking. What do you think? Am I on the right track? Then the writing will come much easier and will flow so much better.
I love it. Absolutely love it. So many good things here. We got to summarize somehow. This is going to be, there's a lot here. This is fun. This is not going to be 20 minutes. Okay, so, big things that we've covered today. The idea of academic tone. Yes, that is important. Yes, we want to have proper structure. Yes, we want to make sure things are on track. But we don't want to be over the top complicated with our word choice, especially if you know, you're still working through what it means to translate well, kind of even just in your own head. We don't have to go overboard. Complex ideas, simple explanation. That's what your professor will be looking for. Practice makes perfect, so spend time practicing writing, reading good writing, getting into that habit of just understanding what the writing is all about, and don't feel like you need to have it perfect on your first draft. It's okay. As we just talked about, you can take that time to meet with people, to work through ideas, to understand what's coming, and how you can build it. And then, Charmain, thank you just so much for all of your ideas on how you be authentic with your voice, with your own experience, what you've learned. Well, yes, trying to figure out how that fits within kind of our like direct structure that we typically have here in North American. Is there anything you want to say just as we wrap up?
I'm excited that people are writing. I think that's amazing. And some of us are not. I'm a natural writer. I enjoy it. I've been writing from very young, and which is great. But for those of us who may not, it's not your skill set. It's not something that you would find joy in. That's okay too. You can still be a solid writer even if it isn't your joy place.
Sure.
And that's okay.
And with that, we're going to wrap up our episode 4. Hopefully, stay tuned for a brand new series that we will be launching soon. And with that, we say, happy learning!